In the run-up to the recently held papal conclave, there was a great deal of real anticipation as well as uneasy anxiety about what the conclave was going to give us as church. For example, people were unsure whether we were going to continue the regression away from the reforms of Vatican II, or whether we were going to show the world a new face, a more open face to society, and to embrace the world that is around us. I think all of us were surprised by the outcome of the conclave. There were three surprises, basically, if I could say three. First, although we now know that Cardinal Bergoglio was rather well known among the cardinals themselves and was almost elected Pope previously, he was a virtual unknown to the rest of us, and especially to commentators on papal affairs. This man had been Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and he was known particularly for his love of the poor. Second surprise was that he was a Jesuit, and for almost 5 centuries there had never been a Jesuit pope, which seems a little unusual. We Franciscans have actually had 4 popes in our history, a 5th if you would include the one pope who was pope during the Great Schism. And a third surprise is the name that he decided to choose for the pontificate, the name of Francis. That no one saw that one coming at all, and it is another first in history. I'd like to make a couple comments about this choice of the name of Francis, since it is so unusual. We now know, in observing him and hearing about him, that Francis was chosen not because of the patronage of his own Jesuit confrere, Francis Xavier, but Francis of Assisi, as he called him, the lover of poverty and of the poor. We've discovered, in looking more closely now at his life, that Archbishop Bergoglio, during his time as Archbishop, really lived a life of great simplicity, in fact, poverty. He lived in a single room, he cooked for himself, they say, and he rode public transportation. He was a friend of simple living. Now, it is not unusual for clerics and ecclesiastics and religious to be urged to have a spiritual detachment from the things of the world. But Pope Francis's approach to poverty is a little bit different. In this, he really does mirror Francis of Assisi, because for him it's not simply an attitude of detachment. He combines simple living with a proximity to the poor. He goes among the poor, he lived among the poor, he worked among the poor. And the thing that's particularly special about Pope Francis now is he brings to the problem of poverty an analysis of why there is poverty in the world. In other words, he shows that there is a connection between the poverty of the world and the policies that the powerful put in place and keep in place. And so he has raised to consciousness for the church and for the world the connection between poverty, material poverty, and what it is we do with our power. A second comment I'd like to make is in reference to something not that he said as Pope or even as Cardinal, but rather something a commentator said immediately after he was elected. Apparently a female commentator on television knew something about the story of Francis. And she said, "This is the Francis who went into a chapel one day outside of Assisi, early in his life, right around the time of his conversion, and heard a crucifix speak to him the words, 'Francis, repair my church.'" She brings this to our awareness, even though Pope Francis himself has not said so. I think this is meant to be a signal to us in the Francis story about what Pope Francis might want his papacy to be about: repairing the church, healing the church. We have at our disposal now some notes that Archbishop Bergoglio scribbled a few days before the conclave began, when he was attending one of these pre-conclave meetings preceded by Mass. Apparently, he was reflecting on the gospel of the day about the woman who was very deformed and why she was deformed. And he tells his fellow bishops, he actually excoriates them and tells them that they have been creating a self-referential church, a church that refers only to them, a church that has been built and created by them for themselves. And he takes them to task for that. And he says there's nothing that produces sickness in the church more, like the deformed woman in the gospel, than being turned in on yourself and creating a church that is really for you as opposed to for the people of God. And he says the cure for this sickness is to go out to the periphery, go out to the edges, and by that means you will be cured. He says the worst sin that the church can commit is what he calls, and he's quoting actually a great theologian of times past, he calls it spiritual worldliness. Spiritual worldliness. In other words, all the trappings of the papal office, the princely character of the ecclesiastics of the church, which, as you know now, he has been shedding little by little. He refused to wear the mozzetta at the time of his announcement as Pope Francis. He's decided not to use the papal apartments. He uses simple forms of transportation. What Pope Francis is calling his fellow bishops and the church at large is to a church that is rooted more in simplicity of life and directly active on behalf of the church. Is this just style, or is this also substance? Well, he has certainly changed the tonality of things immediately after his election. We now have a different conversation about the church than we did prior to the conclave. I think this is very promising for the future of our church.